can go ahead and start and have some people trickle in. Nora, you let me know when.
Oh, you are good to go.
Oh, surprise. Hi, welcome everyone to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law weekly seminar. Today we continue presentations from our pre- and postdoctoral fellows with Hans Lueders, who is a recent PhD in political science from Stanford University's political science department. He's currently a postdoc at CDDRL, and his research seeks to understand the causes and consequences of political inequality in different political contexts. That's the topic of his current book manuscript. He's published in many political science outlets, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Journal of Politics, and as of this week, an acceptance at the American Political Science Review, which is totally amazing. So we look forward to his research, and the Zoom audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box. We'll take questions once Hans is done. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Didi, and thanks everybody for being here today. I'm excited to be talking about my book project on how domestic migration alters politics in post-industrial societies. So millions of voters move within their country every year. And in post-industrial societies, this domestic migration is increasingly associated with the availability of high-skilled job opportunities. So for example, the creation of new jobs in the tech sector has recently created an influx of well-educated people to places such as Austin in the United States, Toronto in Canada, or Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Now, in my research, I study this process in Germany, where domestic migration is equally associated with high-skilled job opportunities. So for example, industrial decline in the Ruhr Valley, the former industrial heartland of Germany, has created an outflux of well-educated people in recent years, while the creation of new jobs in the startup sector in Berlin and the tech sector more broadly in this area is attracting high-skilled people to Berlin and other places. Now, typically, when we think about these processes, we ask about the consequences for national politics. So for example, a lot has been written recently about how post-industrialization pits voters from somewhere and anywhere, urban and rural areas, or in economically declining and booming areas against each other. And likewise, the existing literature on domestic migration in post-industrial societies asks about the national level effects. So for example, a lot has been written about how partisan sorting alters the support bases of the Democratic and Republican parties, how polarization, how the spatial clustering of like-minded voters furthers societal polarization, or how out-migration can contribute to the rise of populism. But what I believe is missing in this literature is an account of the consequences for local politics. And this is the question that I want to answer today. Specifically, I ask how domestic migration influences participation in voting in local politics. And I believe that understanding this connection between migration and local politics is really important because local politics has fundamental consequences for voters' everyday lives. So for example, in the case of Germany, it is local governments that take care of the provision of services such as childcare or public transportation. And what might be even more important about local politics is that local politics actually has important consequences for national politics and representation. It is typically local partisans on the ground that connect national parties to the preferences of voters on the ground. And it's also local partisans who are often recruited for national office. Now, in my talk today, I want to convince you that domestic migration creates two distinct electorates based on people's very different interests and levels of engagement in national and local politics. I will try to show you that domestic migration creates what I call nationally minded electorates in migration areas, where voters care a lot about national politics, but where they don't care as much about local politics. And in out-migration areas, domestic migration creates what I call locally minded electorate, where voters don't care as much about national politics, but where they're really interested in local politics. And I will try to convince you that these effects, the creation of these two electorates is driven by the sorting of voters who already prior to migration differ in their political attitudes. And then migration just redistributes these voters. I will show you that in these two electorates, participation in voting in national and local elections, as well as civil society, work fundamentally differently. And I will also show you some evidence that this process has important consequences for party behavior and political representation. Specifically, I will show you some evidence that it leads to the political underrepresentation of out-migration areas. And to do all that, I will provide evidence from a series of new data sets that I've created and collected on politics in contemporary Germany. So my talk will proceed in 3 steps. I will start with a discussion and description of the systematic differences in political attitudes between domestic migrants and non-migrants. And to do so, I will draw on household panel data to show you that these attitudes differ, and importantly, that attitudes remain stable even over the course of migration. And I think this is important because it suggests that migration redistributes voters with distinct political attitudes. And the second step, I ask what this means for politics in the aggregate. And I will show you that it leads to distinct electorates with consequences for the nationalization of local elections, or the extent to which local elections are decided based on locally instead of national, the extent to which local elections are decided based on national instead of locally defined issues. I will show you that it alters voting in municipal elections, and I will show you that it alters civil society. And in the third step, I ask what all of this means for party behavior and political representation. And I will show you some evidence that it alters campaigning among the mainstream political parties in Germany. So for migration to have an effect on politics, one kind of starting point should be to examine whether migrants are different from non-migrants. So this is the first step in my argument. And I will show you that because migrants tend to be better educated, but tend to have weaker local attachments, domestic migrants are more active in national politics, whereas domestic non-migrants are more active in local politics. And I will show you some evidence in support of this from a large household panel data. So from existing work, we know already that migrants tend to be better educated, at least in the post-industrial societal context. And this is because the primary reason for migration is the pursuit of higher education. And recently, a lot of attractive jobs that keep attracting migrant voters are in the high skill sector. Moreover, we know that migrants tend to have weaker local attachments. This is because strong ties to your local community can deter migration. If you have strong ties to your family, to your friends, you're less likely to leave. And moreover, once you have moved, it typically takes a long time to develop a new sense of belonging to your new place of residence, which again keeps your local attachments weaker. Now, what do these two differences mean for participation in politics, in national and local politics? First, because migrants tend to be better educated than non-migrants, I argue that they should be more likely to participate in national politics. Then this is because education typically comes with more political knowledge, which lowers the costs of political participation. But because non-migrants are more attached to their local communities, I expect them to be more active in local politics. And this is because local attachments may come with an increased sense that local political engagement is non-migrant civic duty, and will also come similarly with increased familiarity with local political issues, which again should lower the costs of political participation. To support this idea, I draw on a large household panel data. This comes from the German socioeconomic panel, a data set that was originally launched by a survey that was originally launched in 1984 and conducted every year since. So the survey is quite unique because it allows me to track voter attitudes over the course of more than 3 decades. For this analysis, I collapsed the data across individuals. So basically, I will compare averages by individual. And I identify migrants as all those respondents who have moved at least once across county borders while in the survey. They are about 17% of the survey. And I focus on across county migration here because counties are an important political unit in Germany. They are responsible for a range of services, and in size, they're about comparable to American counties. And then to estimate differences between migrants and non-migrants, I regress a series of outcomes and an indicator for migrants and a minimal set of control variables. And then the coefficient on this indicator for migrants reflects the extent to which migrants and non-migrants differ. So the results are summarized in this plot. On the horizontal axis, you can't see my clicker, I'm sorry. I show you the difference between migrants and non-migrants expressed in percent relative to the mean of this variable. So first, recall that we know from the existing literature that migrants tend to be better educated. I find support for this across a variety of outcomes. Here, I'm just looking at years of education. I find that migrants are about 7% better educated according to this measure. which translates into about 3/4 of a year. And as I had argued, education should come with more participation in national politics. And this is exactly what I find. I find that migrants are about 7% more likely to say that national political participation is important. They're about 21% more likely to say they're interested in politics. They're 7% more likely to feel close to a political party, and about 4% more likely to vote in national elections. However, migrants are less attached to their local communities. And the data is again consistent with the idea. I find that they're about 13% less likely to say that they're attached to their local place of residence. And with weaker attachments to their place of residence comes less participation in local politics. So migrants are about 10% less likely to participate in a local citizen initiative, 21% less likely to participate in local voluntary organizations, and about 60% less likely to attend church. Now, one key question here, like having shown you these differences between migrants and non-migrants, and the aggregate is, where do these differences come from? Do they exist already prior to migration, or are they a product of migration? I argue that attitudes are relatively stable and that these differences exist already prior to migration, and that migration doesn't necessarily alter these attitudes. So this is what we commonly refer to in the literature as the sorting argument, whereby migration simply redistributes voters with different characteristics. But a powerful alternative that some voters have proposed is that migration actually can change the attitudes of migrants. And here then, if that were the case, then migration wouldn't necessarily alter politics in the ways that I envision. The critical test here is to what extent attitudes change following a move. Now, testing this, like pursuing this question is actually really difficult in the existing work because in cross-sectional data on migrants, the observations are typically the same. Typically we lack the longitudinal household panel data to track migrants for a sufficient number of years prior and after their move. But fortunately, this data exists in the case of Germany. So to examine to what extent migration alters attitudes, I regress a series of attitudes on a series of fixed effects to take out any variation across respondent, county, and year. And then I include indicators for the number of years before and after people have moved. So taken together, these indicators allow me to examine to what extent attitudes deviate around a move from the overall trend in attitudes among everybody else. And I just want to show you the results for 4 outcomes. I examine people's political interest and their self-placement on a left-right political scale to examine whether attitudes towards national politics changes. And then I focus on local politics, in particular whether people's attachment to their place of residence changes after a move and whether they participate more or less in local voluntary associations. And I will show you a series of regression coefficients. Each coefficient indicates for the indicated number of years before or after the move, whether there's a statistically significant deviation from the overall trend, which is indicated with the horizontal 0 line. So if there's a deviation, this should suggest that attitudes change around the move. If there's no deviation, this would suggest that attitudes remain stable. Now let's look at political interest first. I find that there's no deviation from the trend in attitudes in the decade before a move. There's no deviation in the year of the move. There's also no deviation in the 10 years after a move. And the results are the same for left-right orientation. So for these 2 measures of national political participation or interest, there's not really any change in attitudes surrounding a move, which is consistent with the sorting argument, which is consistent with the idea that attitudes differ already prior to a move. Things look a little different for these other 2 outcomes. When it comes to people's attachment to their place of residence, I see already that there's some downward trend starting a few years after a move. But importantly, people's attachment to their place of residence goes back up to their pre-migration level. And the results are the same for local voluntary organizations. So again, this is more consistent with the idea that if at all, there's a temporary decrease in attitudes towards local politics, but there's no evidence that attitudes change lastingly after a move. This is then consistent with the idea that if at all, migration has an effect on politics through the redistribution of voters with distinct political attitudes. Now, having shown you these systematic differences in attitudes between migrants and non-migrants, the next step of this question is, what are the consequences of this for politics in the aggregate? And I propose that it creates two distinct electorates. And in migration areas, the concentration of migrant voters who are very active in national politics, but who don't care as much about local politics, creates what I call nationally minded electorate. And in out-migration areas, this process creates a locally minded electorate where voters don't care as much about national politics, but where they're more invested in local politics. And I want to show you the implications of this argument for three outcomes: for the nationalization of local elections, for voting in municipal elections, and for civil society. And to do that, I use comprehensive data on domestic migration in Germany. This data exists because all individuals who reside in Germany are by federal law required to register their address of residence and any change of address with their home municipality. And once they've done that, they also automatically register to vote, provided, of course, they're German citizens. I access the raw data on every individual move in Germany in a secure data center, and it extracted information on the number of cross-county moves again, and I restrict the analysis to German citizens. Now, using this data, I will test three implications of this idea that migration creates two distinct electorates. The first one considers the nationalization of local elections, which is a big concern among scholars of electoral politics in Western Europe and the United States. Where local elections are nationalized, we see an increasing primacy of national over local politics. That means that people don't really care as much about local politics anymore. They don't participate as much anymore. And if they participate, they will vote similarly in both local and national elections. So the key question is, when evaluating whether voters contribute to the nationalization of local elections, is to what extent voters remain interested in and knowledgeable about local politics. But recall that I argued that non-migrants are more interested and knowledgeable about local politics, so they should be more likely to participate in local elections, and they should also be more likely to consider different issues in local and national elections. So this leads to the following expectations. We should see more nationalization in migration areas and less nationalization in out-migration areas. To measure nationalization and test these expectations, I compare the election results of federal and state legislative elections. I focus on state elections because state politics has important implications, in particular for local politics in Germany, for local service delivery, and so forth. So I expect voters to vote in state elections based on their local political preferences. And using this comparison, I create two measures of nationalization. One considers the difference in turnout between federal and state elections. Larger values here reflect more nationalization because it reflects relatively more participation in federal elections. The second measure is an overall measure of the difference in the election results across all parties. Larger values here mean less nationalization because they reflect that voters vote, or they suggest that voters vote more differently in these two types of elections. Now again, the goal of my analysis is to relate variation in the nationalization of local elections to domestic migration. One obvious concern or question is, how can we make sure that migration actually has a causal effect? My solution here is that I pursue an instrumental variables regression that exploits plausibly exogenous variation in migration flows. And the instrument I use is a shift-share instrument that has been widely used in research on international migration, but here I adopted for the study of domestic migration. The key idea behind the shift-share instrument is that we seek to relate migration to or from a particular place, let's call it County A, to changes in migration or shocks to migration elsewhere, let's call that place County B. So this is what we refer to as a shift. And it could be, for example, caused by the creation of a new college or the closure of a big factory. But importantly, we argue that the extent to which the shift in County B alters migration to and from County A depends on the existing migratory ties between both places. So that is what we refer to as a share. This follows the insight that migration tends to be highly path dependent, such that if in the past a large share of migrants from B moved to A, then we should also expect that any shift in migration in County B has a larger effect on migration flows in County A. I use this approach to create two distinct measures, instruments, one for immigration, one for emigration, and then take the difference. So the instrument I use in my analysis is a shift share instrument for net migration. Another important kind of requirement for this approach is that there is some shift in migration patterns that we can exploit. And I argue that it occurred around 2005 in the context of a major welfare reform in Germany and a redistribution of job market opportunities in its aftermath. So following German reunification in 1990 until like about 2005, domestic migration looked something like this. We had almost uniform out-migration from East Germany, as indicated by different shades of red. And we had almost uniform in-migration in West Germany, as indicated by different shades of blue. But this changed right after 2005. Just 2 years later, a lot of counties in West Germany started to experience out-migration. Another decade later, actually, we can no longer distinguish between East and West Germany looking at migration flows alone. So now we have a lot of out-migration from the Ruhr Valley, for example, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and a lot of in-migration in new industrial clusters, for example, around Dresden and Leipzig. So to recap, in my empirical strategy, I seek to relate variation in nationalization to variation in domestic migration, exploiting the shift in domestic migration and using a shift share instrument. This plot summarizes the results of the analysis for the two measures of nationalization that I've introduced earlier. So let's start with the difference in turnout. Recall that here larger values mean more nationalization because it means that more people vote in federal compared to state elections. So this means that I expect a positive effect of net migration as more people move in. The clustering of migrant voters means that these voters will be very active in national politics, won't turn out as much in local politics or local elections. And this is precisely what I find. I find that a 1 percentage point increase in net migration is associated with an increase in this turnout differential by about 11%. The second outcome I want to look at is the difference in the election result. So recall here that larger values mean less nationalization because they reflect more distinct election results. So this means that I expect a negative effect of net migration as more people move into a place. These people lack the local knowledge to make distinct electoral choices in subnational elections, so they will simply consider national politics in subnational voting, resulting in more similar results. And this is again exactly what I find. I find that an increase in net migration by 1 percentage point is associated with a decrease in this variable by about 0.22 standard deviations. Now, to summarize, I've shown you that domestic migration influences the extent to which local net elections are nationalized. I argue that one channel for which this happens is that migration changes voting in local elections. And this is the second implication of my argument that I want to support now. And here, my argument exploits the fact that there's two distinct candidates in Germany who run in local elections. One type of candidate is associated with any of the national political parties, such as these two candidates who identify as members of the Christian Democrats or the Green Party. Now, voting for these candidates doesn't require any local political knowledge because the party label provides you with sufficient information about what these candidates will stand for. This is different for the second type of candidates who are either affiliated with a local party, which only exists in one or a few municipalities, or who aren't affiliated with any party. Now, supporting these candidates requires more investment in local politics, more local knowledge, because voters cannot rely on national party cues. This suggests that non-migrants should be better equipped to support the second type of candidates, leading to the expectation I want to test here, namely that support for national political candidates should be weaker in out-migration areas. To test this expectation, I've collected new data on municipal elections in Germany over time. And in this plot, I will show you the vote share of all national party candidates separately for in and out-migration areas. And while there's some decrease in support for national party candidates in migration areas, this decrease pales in comparison to what is going on in out-migration areas. So I compute that in out-migration areas, voting for national party candidates decreases by about 1/3. And again, this is consistent with the idea that voters turn away from national party candidates in local elections in out-migration areas. Now, I've shown you in two ways that domestic migration changes voting patterns. But I also want to show you that domestic migration actually alters more than voting. So this is the third implication of my argument that I want to test. And here I want to provide you some evidence that domestic migration alters the political role of local attachments. The expectation I want to test is that local attachments should become less important in politics in in-migration areas because migrant voters simply don't have like strong local attachments. And we should expect the opposite in out-migration areas. Now, of course, measuring local attachments directly is really difficult. It would require us to run a massive survey that creates fine-grained estimates of the strength of local attachments at like the locality level. So I use a proxy instead, which employs comprehensive data on all civil society organizations, or CSOs, in Germany that I've collected. And I want to focus on one type of civil society organizations in particular, which I call local identity CSOs. So those are organizations whose goals are defined with respect to a particular locality, and they seek to preserve and celebrate the traditions and the history of this particular locality. So for example, carnival societies are a local identity CSO according to my definition. They advance local traditions by organizing celebrations and parties and parades during the carnival season. And historical associations are another example of local identity CSOs. They commemorate local history through local museums or by offering guided tours for visitors. Now, again, the expectation is that these organizations should become less prevalent in in-migration areas and if at all more prevalent in out-migration areas. To test this idea, this plot will show you the average number of new local identity CSOs founded every year in both in and out-migration areas, and it's scaled by population. And as expected, there's quite a dramatic decrease in the prevalence of these local identity CSOs in migration areas. And if at all, there's a slight increase in the prevalence of these local identity CSOs in out-migration areas. So again, this is consistent with the idea that the strength and importance of local identities changes over time. Now, I've shown you in different ways that domestic migration creates like two distinct electorates. But you may wonder, why does this actually matter? What are the consequences of all of this for example, political representation? And I want to show you some evidence that it leads to the political underrepresentation of out-migration areas. And to make this argument, I want to return to a plot that I just showed you a couple of minutes ago, which shows that there's decreasing support for national party candidates in local elections in out-migration areas. Now, given that German municipalities, or most German municipalities, use some form of proportional representation, it is unsurprising probably that this decrease in vote share comes with a decrease in seat shares in municipal councils held by local party, by candidates affiliated with a national party. So about just 20 years ago, again, the clicker doesn't show, national party candidates held more than 50% of seats in municipal councils. This is down to about 35% just 2 decades later. So in other words, in a way, national parties lose strength in local politics in out-migration areas. And I would argue that this is a really significant development because local partisan strength is really important also for like the national political party. On the one hand, it is local partisans that help national parties learn about local party preferences. It is local partisans who are often recruited for national political office. So for example, in the German case, 61% of German MPs started their political career in local politics. But of course, if national parties don't have a foot in local politics anymore, then the question is whether national parties will either recruit their elites somewhere else, or then their elites won't have these connections to their local communities anymore. And third, local partisans help or support national parties in organizing political campaigns. For example, by putting out campaign posters, conducting get out the vote efforts, or organizing campaign rallies for some of the more prominent politicians. So this leads me to the expectation that political parties should shift their attention away from out-migration areas because they don't have the organizational capacity there anymore, resulting in the underrepresentation of out-migration areas. And I want to show you one piece of suggestive evidence that is consistent with this idea. And this evidence comes from a comprehensive data set of all campaign stubs of the major German politicians during the 2017 German federal election campaign. So the data that I've collected counts every single campaign appearance that Chancellor Angela Merkel made during the 2 months before the election. I add the campaign stops by our social democratic challenger Martin Schulz, and the campaign stops by the main candidates of the smaller German parties. I then created a count of the total number of campaign stops across all parties in each county and used Poisson regression to relate this to variation in net migration. And in this plot, I will show you the predicted number of campaign stops for each value of net migration in Germany computed over the past decade. So if my argument is correct, that parties shift their attention to in-migration areas, there should be a positive relationship between net migration and campaigning, all else equal. And this is exactly what I find. I find, for example, that moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile on the distribution of net migration is associated with an increase in campaigning by about 22%. So to summarize, I've tried to convince you today that because migrants differ in fundamental ways from non-migrants, domestic migration creates two distinct electorates. It creates a nationally minded electorate in migration areas where voters care a lot about national politics, where they don't care as much about local politics. And it creates a locally minded electorate in out-migration areas where voters aren't as invested in national politics, but relatively speaking, more invested in local politics. I've tried to give you some evidence that this effect is driven by the sorting of voters whose preferences differ already prior to their move. I've tried to show you a series of implications of this process for voting and participation in national and local elections, as well as civil society. And I've tried to show you some evidence that it has important implications for the behavior of political parties and political representation. Now, what are the implications of these findings? I think one key implication considers the role of local attachments and local ideas in politics. Despite worries to the contrary, my research suggests that local politics continues to be significant, at least in some places. A lot has been written recently about how post-industrialization alters national politics. My research suggests that it also has an important local dimension. And third, a lot has been written about how recent electoral change in post-industrial democracies creates a new dichotomy between cosmopolitan and nationalist political attitudes. My research suggests that local political attitudes might even stand in some sort of contrast to this dichotomy. And lastly, I've identified local political attachments as an important factor in politics that I'm excited to conduct more research on in the future. So taken together, my book project identifies domestic migration as a significant independent variable that helps us understand some of the fundamental changes in electoral politics that post-industrial societies have experienced in recent decades. And I believe that understanding the role of domestic migration here is important because this research has important implications for our understanding of political inequality, service delivery, and democratic backsliding. Thank you.
A reminder that if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll add you to the list. So I too, and then Nick.
Thank you. This was a great and very illuminating talk. I want to ask about is this a story about the differentiation between the in-migration areas and out-migration areas, or the migrants and the rest of the society? Because you didn't say much about I'm going to call them natives, but natives of the in-migration areas. So did you see any difference between them and the migrants, or do the migrants change the politics in the in-migration areas totally? So that's my question.
Yeah, so I've actually looked into to what extent migration alters the preferences of non-migrants, either in areas that experience a lot of out-migration or in areas that experience a lot of in-migration. Now, this is a bit tricky to do using the data that I have, because I think even though I have information on counties, I would prefer to go even more local. But to do that, I would have to go back into some sort of secure data center in Germany, which obviously wasn't possible this last year. But based on the research I've done, there's actually little evidence. What I found very surprising as well, there's little evidence that there's massive attitudinal changes, at least among non-migrants. Now, I haven't looked into particular vote choices. So I think that might be one way how this might like change, or how my migration might impact the behavior of non-migrants. But at least when it comes to like the outcomes that I've considered in my presentation, there's not really any like big change.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
That maybe this is not the independent variable is not the migration, but the fact that like the technological changes are happening in one place or in one cluster of the cities, right? So
Yeah.
why do you think the migration is the runner here? Why do you think the migration is the driver of this story then? If there's also an effect on natives in the migration.
So the question, just to make sure I understand, the question is like, say we have like big industrial change in one area, and this has like one effect through migration, but it should also have an effect like directly on people, like who stay behind. Yeah, so I'm not arguing against that. I think that's absolutely plausible. And I mean, there's like a lot of evidence that this is the case. In my research, I'm like particularly interested in this like one channel. Yeah, but I mean, I 100% agree with you that there's a lot going on with outside this migration channel.
So I have Nick and then Carlos.
Yeah, so thanks, Hans. The amount of data analysis was really quite impressive. So I believe this argument about the nationalization of local politics, but I think I'm skeptical of your measure of nationalization using turnout. And I guess when I think of the nationalization of local politics, I think about Berkeley residents showing up to a city council meeting, asking for a stand on the Iraq War, like, a stand on the Paris Peace Accords or excuse me, climate accords. So it's about voters holding local politicians accountable for issues that transcend their authority. And I wonder if there's any evidence that you see of this happening in the German context. And I mean, I think you could use public opinion surveys in which they ask, what's the most important issue, facing German society today, and sort of look at it that way. And I guess the second question is about the implication of your argument, your theory, which is like, what are the effects on governance here? So if you're saying that there are these out-migration regions where a lot of people care about local politics, theoretically that should have sort of downstream effects on the quality of local governance in terms of, say, education or policing or these other things. And do we in fact see that? Because I think my expectation would be the reverse, that those out-migration places are suffering a lot in terms of the quality of governance. So yeah, those are my two questions.
Great, yeah. So actually, can we start with the second one? Because I would like to hear your thoughts on why you, so I have like lots of thoughts on like either way, how like out migration areas could see an increase or decrease in the quality of service delivery. But I would love to hear your, like the mechanism that you have in mind, and then I will tell you what I think.
So I guess my thought comes from the American context, in which you see, say, Rust Belt cities having a lot of out migration, places like Austin. The tax base is totally decimated in these places, so they really can't bring in resources to boost sort of capacity in local education.
Yeah, so I think no, I think this is absolutely right, and I definitely agree with that. So like the broader question was like, what are the effects on like governance, right? And this is definitely on my agenda for like the remainder of the book. I just haven't had a chance to look into that yet. But I'm like really excited to like figure out how it like changes local politics or like policy outcomes in a way. And I think there's like a lot of things potentially going on that might like, go against each other. So I think it's absolutely true that, relatively wealthy, well-educated people moving out means like that there's a lower tax base. So that might be detrimental to service delivery. Also, if it's true that like people vote very differently in local and national politics and out-migration areas, another mechanism is that this might increase the probability of divided government, which has been shown to also like reduce access to intergovernmental transfers, right? So from this kind of like perspective, yeah, absolutely, it's like possible that it is detrimental to service delivery. But on the other hand, some of this effect might be mitigated by the fact that these voters might be better able to hold their politicians accountable for their local political behavior, and not, did you mention, was the Iraq War or something for the Berkeley student, or like whatever, like, is on like the Berkeley students like mind. Yes. So because like, so I think this is like really interesting, because it means that if like you have a local council meeting and everybody only wants to talk about national politics, then what are your incentives to actually deliver on local goods? And I think in that sense, out-migration areas might have an advantage because voters there might be more able to hold their local leaders accountable. And that's like one of the big concerns that people have with the nationalization of local politics. It's like undermining of accountability. And on your other question about the measure of nationalization, so I use these measures because they're kind of like what the literature would use that I'm referring to in American politics. I totally agree that it would be great to look at different priorities. I've looked a little bit into that, but unfortunately, usually these surveys don't really allow people to give a lot of free for all answers, right? There's typically some categories or so it makes it really hard actually to see what voters really care about. And then if voters say, well, I really care about unemployment, that this is a national issue, a local issue. It's just really hard, but I agree with you that some of these, that would be really good to look into. That was a long answer, I'm sorry.
Carlos.
Yeah, so I have two related questions. So the first one kind of deals with the temporality of your analysis. You said your analysis starts in 1984 to the present. And I was just wondering a little bit if you can just talk a little bit more about what makes you say the migrants throughout these 2 decades are pretty much the same. Because you can imagine the people that are coming in right at 1989, some of them were all of them perhaps motivated differently than the ones that are currently just motivated for perhaps economic reasons.
Yeah.
Which brings into a question about the shift share, your instrument you're using. So if the early migrants, again, I'm assuming the pre-Berlin Wall migrants are different, than is that share actually capturing those close connections, just close movements in the modern day?
Yeah. Okay. So that was one, on your first question, whether migrants are actually the same over time, was one of I had a big concern about that too, in particular following the fall of the Berlin Wall and a massive amount of East Germans, I think 4 million over the course of the last 30 years, moving to the West. But I looked into that actually, and to my surprise, if I only look at differences between migrants and non-migrants in the between 1984 and 1989, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, I don't have all of the variables, unfortunately, but for the variables that I looked at, there are still these differences in local and national political participation. So I don't think that the story is entirely driven by, or it's relatively independent of East-West migration.
Sorry, so just difference in participation, or also in other characteristics like education, attachment to.
Oh, so the differences for local and national political participation are still there. I think there's still an education difference and a local attachment difference. Yeah. So I was honestly very surprised to see that too, but yeah, it remains quite stable. And then on the shift share instrument, so the analysis actually, because of I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but it requires a ton of computation, a ton of data, and part of the data that I'm using for this is actually only available starting in 2000. So actually the full analysis that I'm doing only looks at 1998 to 2017. It's a 2-period comparison using the first differences design. Pre-period is 1998 to 2005, and then it's 2007 to 2017. So it doesn't capture the immediate post-reunification migration.
All right, I have you in the back, but I'm going to sneak in here before we take some other questions and ask. So this is a really fascinating story about attitudes and their effects on vote share. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about at the elite level, what the national parties have been doing. There was a huge kerfuffle about Thomas Piketty writing a new paper with a few co-authors about the social bases of parties shifting over time, so that left parties are increasingly supported by highly educated beneficiaries of globalization and the knowledge economy, and all these comparativists responded being no, we said that first, Kitchell said it in 1994, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, academic scuffles, it happens on Twitter, does it really happen in real life? Who knows? But the point is that the parties could also have changed their electoral strategies to only mobilize these types of voters in major cities or places that are much more economically productive. And that is part of the explanation for far-right parties organizing in places that have been, quote, left behind. Is this something that you think is part of the story here, or?
Yes, absolutely. So, most of this talk, I overemphasize probably the demand side of politics. I mean, I really overemphasize how voters change, how the redistribution of voters change. But for example, when it comes to voting for national political candidates, well, obviously if the parties decide not to nominate anybody, then you can vote for anybody, for any national political candidate. So that means yeah, it's probably a combination of both. But I do think that at least part of the story is driven by voter attitudes, because otherwise we wouldn't see these changes in the local identity CSOs. But I think it's absolutely plausible that parties like change their outreach strategies or so. I mean, we have some evidence that I showed you. The campaign stuff evidence is consistent with this idea. And then actually one thing that I didn't have the time to talk about, which is like also related to that, is I looked at using the biographies of the members of the German parliament that basically was just voted out of office. I tried to compute, kind of like see to what extent in and out migration areas are equally represented by the members of parliament, or whether like more members of parliament come from in migration areas. So I created I actually can show you this if I can have the mouse for a second.
This is very organized.
So this is some sort of like pseudo Gini coefficient where I could compute for. So basically we have like the population here based on like deciles, like this is like the first decile living in the most strongest out migration places. This is like the most in migration places. And then I compute the cumulative share of MPs in Germany by party that are that live in each share. So we have the in each decile, and we have the 45-degree line, which means like which would mean like perfect equality. So like I don't know, fourth decile we would have like 40% of MPs that live in like an area with like at least or like that is in the first 4 deciles. And anyways, so the point is these curves are all below the 45-degree line, which suggests that there's a bias towards in-migration areas.
Okay. Thank you. All right, I have Marcel, then Brett, then Hisham. And
Oops.
So
you can leave it on.
Sorry, actually, let me just, okay.
My question is more like an observation, something that started to occur to me as I was listening to you. European migration. So I said, I lived in England for many years, and so as a Belgian, I could vote in the national elections in Belgium, but I could not vote in national elections in England. I could only vote in local elections. Now you learned that actually I didn't care about local elections. Thank you, right?
Yes, consistent with the theory.
I really wanted to vote in national elections.
Yeah.
In fact, if people like me in England had been allowed to vote in Britain, they would not be the person. Okay, so now the thing is, in Europe, it is because you have all the advantages of the resident. You don't need to change your nationality, which would be the condition to be able to vote in national elections. But people, the only incentive for doing that is to be able to vote in it. So it's not enough of an incentive to make the effort. So it basically freezes. It freezes this pattern that basically you can have countries like in England that was accepting lots of migrants, and they had no representation. Kind of weird, because in the US, but they can move as soon as you move across state line, you vote in another state. So I don't know whether this is something you have some ideas about, or is something you want to study later, because it really is really important.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. So on like a data kind of, I only look at like German nationals. So even if you like move to Germany, you wouldn't be in the data set, but I think so. I've like definitely thought about like how all of this relates to international migration, but I actually have been focusing more on like non-EU migration, like in the context of like the refugee crisis, for example. But here, actually, like to my own surprise, I found actually there's no correlation between domestic and international migration at like the county level, and I think that makes sense because a lot of like refugees, for example, were like allocated specifically to places that in the past maybe experienced out migration, but not today. Yeah. So long story short, I think I'm definitely very interested in that, and I have so far focused on domestic migration. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, great. So I enjoyed the presentation very much, and the level of data you have is a really fascinating story. I was curious so I kind of have a bigger picture question about maybe kind of what's driving the domestic migrants themselves, and then kind of why it matters, I guess. Would you go back to the slide you showed it maybe early on, maybe about 5 minutes about how out migrants, how their attitudes changed or were stable around the date of the move?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so the story that you've kind of told is, out migrants being better educated, in some sense, kind of being more cosmopolitan, kind of moving to other parts of the country, voters kind of being, being a decline of local attachments, and maybe we should care about that. But I guess I look at the lower the lower left-hand graph, and I see. I don't really see the story about, or maybe it is the case that, as you're saying, that out migrants are better educated, but it also seems like to be the case that like those out migrants, 4, 5, maybe even, I guess maybe around 5 or 3 years before leaving. Like, why shouldn't we view them as sort of frustrated at the opportunities that they don't have, right? In the place where they're currently living, for whatever reason, right? So I guess I'm inclined to see this as a story of economic frustration, right? And then if out migrants are kind of frustrated at the lack of economic opportunities, then of course they shift attention to national politics, right? Because like economic policy tends to be set, certainly at the national level, right? So to me, like this, I wonder if this is just like kind of a very kind of straightforward story of voters shifting to the national level because kind of like that's where they perceive their grievances can be addressed, right? And then I thought the Merkel and her Social Democratic Challenger, I thought that was a really sort of fantastic addition. And so then kind of consistent with that, we see national level politicians sort of kind of like approaching voters who really kind of care about national level policies. And and maybe these things will kind of be set whenever like a different set of people has like different economic grievances. So I guess I kind of see this as, I don't know, I guess I'm just not persuaded necessarily that what's really going on is sort of this like identity shift and decline of local attachments rather than a very kind of rational response to the lack of economic.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is so I'm still also trying to like figure out why we see this like decrease.
Yeah, like that's like a
more
fascinating piece of like
yeah. So I think to me this is really interesting as well, and I can't give you like a definite answer what is going on. So like one story could be, I think as you rightly point out, that I'm just like really frustrated about the economic opportunities in my place. And I realize that, and like I become detached from the place where I live, and then like I decide to move. And then like I move, and like the new place, like I have better economic opportunities, so I feel more.
And like you're happy, right? Yeah, for the right side.
I think this is definitely consistent with this idea. But I think I want to push back a little bit to the idea that it's all about economic frustration that like drives this like turn towards national political interest, because while it is true that we see this like change here in like local interest and like participation, if I think your story was like the main mechanism that we would also see a shift towards like national political interest prior to the move, and that's not something that I observe, unfortunately. But I mean, good for my.
Okay, Brett, let's have a few more questions.
Yeah.
So, but I'm happy to chat more about this because I'm definitely also trying to figure out what's going on.
Sean?
Thank you so much. I'm much excited. I learned a lot from the presentation and really enjoyed it. So I'm trying to think a little bit about the causal mechanisms here. So there are two possible stories. One story is that the people who have certain traits that make them inclined to be more nationally oriented, more participatory, are more likely to migrate, versus another story where the encounter or the experience of migration causes certain triggers that makes people like become more interested in national politics. You move somewhere, you go into the middle of nowhere, or you're moving from the middle of nowhere to an urban center, and you say, well, this country is headed for the gutter. I need to actually be more politically engaged. We need to sort of save this place from what it's becoming. That's kind of like one possible story. It sounded to me from the presentation that you're leaning towards the first story than the second, although from your answer to Brett's question, it sounded like you're still trying to figure that part out. But I would, I would say, like, how does that, I mean, if you believe it's the first story, I think that has important implications for what we make of this argument as we interpret its significance outside of Germany. Because if it's actually people who are more likely to migrate have certain traits that makes them participate more likely to participate more in national politics, then my guess would be that the structural preconditions of why these people are migrating in the first place, what is the shock that's pushing people towards migration, will have significant implications as to how these dynamics could play out in other contexts. Because if that's the case, then people migrating because of the health tech sector is really vibrant in certain parts of the country, so they move, versus a situation where people are leaving the agricultural sector and moving to the big cities, or the industrial sector is falling in certain regions, and therefore people are moving elsewhere for low skilled labor. It sounds to me like the dynamics and the trends will look very, very different in these cases. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, especially with regards to the causal mechanisms and how we can make sense of that story outside of Germany, particularly like how these other structural factors that are pushing it, how these would affect the attitudinal shifts that you observe specifically in Germany.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's so the mechanism that I want to advance. Do I have time to respond? Or?
You do, yes.
Okay, good. So the mechanism that I'm trying to advance is, like, as you rightly pointed out, that like attitudes remain relatively stable over time, and then it's just like a reshuffling of voters with different attitudes. And I agree. I was also, I think, when I looked at this plot in particular, I was a little surprised that there was like more going on in terms of like attitudinal shifts. And I think this is because there's like a huge debate in the literature about exactly that. I think this is I'm thinking about like writing a paper on this and like trying to figure out why attitudes change in some contexts and not in others. But I do think that like maybe one explanation, which gets closer to like a question about scope conditions, in effect about why we don't see more changes in attitudes, might be about like the type of migration that we see in Germany. So most migration in Germany is between cities. There's only very little like migration from like rural parts to urban parts, where we would actually, that's I think the type of migration where we would expect a lot of like attitudinal change, because people move from like smaller places to like big urban areas and are confronted with a ton of like new people, whole different like socio-cultural environment and so forth. But that's not really something that is all that prevalent in Germany. So I think that's like maybe one type of one part, one like important scope condition. And the other one is, I think it's really about post-industrialization and the idea of like, what are the attractive job opportunities for which people move? And I think in Germany, it's like high skill jobs. In the US, it would mainly be high skill jobs, at least when we think about domestic migration. So here we would expect, according to my theory, these like differences in national and local political attitudes. I think things would look very different in a setting where people don't move for high skill opportunities, where people are maybe pushed out of their like villages or like places, lack maybe like a lot of education, but like seek refuge in cities, for example, then I think we would see something very different. So yeah. But if you have, I would love to chat more with you about like more ideas about scope conditions, because that's an important question, obviously.
Marissa, and then you in the jacket.
Sorry, I arrived late, so perhaps you said this, I apologize. But I was just curious how long this effect lasts when people move to a new area and they focus on national politics. But if they stay, do you expect them to then become more involved in local politics?
Yes, so I do think that's what's going on. Yeah, so I think initially, definitely, it's like really hard for you to participate in local politics because there's not really reason for you, because you don't know any like about any of the services, you don't know anything about the like important political cleavages and anything. But like as you've like spent maybe like 5 or 10 years, I do expect you to like be more active in local politics. But I think this is again consistent with this idea, and like I can show you a similar plot for like other measures of local political participation, where you wouldn't necessarily become more active than you were before. You would just like return to like your baseline level of like before the move.
So I might still remain more nationally oriented.
Yes.
If I was nationally oriented.
Yes, so maybe like the difference changes a little bit, but it doesn't like completely flip.
Yeah, two things. One, going back to the attachment to place of residence. We talked a bit about the economic aspect of why people may feel driven and pushed from their former place of residence to out-migrate. I just wanted to suggest that perhaps there is a cultural or social dimension where they're essentially part of like a different social group, maybe with a more highly educated group, one that's oriented toward more high-skilled jobs. Perhaps that leads to a bit of like a social feeling out of place of a particular community they live, which over time can accumulate to a, I guess we could call like a tipping point at which they want to move to like a place where they're surrounded by people who are more like them. That was just one thing that I was thinking about attachment to place of residence. And the other bigger question is when I look at the out-migration, the political orientation, there doesn't seem to be very much variance between before and after. And correct me if I'm wrong in this understanding, because maybe I'm making a false conclusion here, a false assumption. But if there is a bit of like a more cosmopolitan, possibly left-wing orientation of out-migrants and out-migration areas, and maybe a more localist or conservative orientation of people in out-migration areas and more liberal cosmopolitan and in-migration areas, then do you think, I guess, what are the effects that you can foresee of that having on the political discourse between those two groups if the out-migration areas formerly had a split or like a larger ecosystem of more very political and social views, and now are reaching a point where it's a more homogenous ideological or social outlook? Particularly perhaps polarization is one that immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, thank you. So I will start with the second question. This is like also something I'm like really interested in, and this is like on the agenda for like the next part of the book project.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there's like probably like when it comes to like polarization, there's like two things going on. Like I agree with you, like in a way we could think about these like communities becoming more homogenous over time, and then obviously like we have like more polarization across these places. But I also think that like one mechanism, like you suggest one mechanism about like the like sorting. I think another mechanism is like how parties respond. And I do think there's like quite some evidence that like parties just don't represent these areas as well. And I think this is, and then polarization is just like, maybe even a response to this underrepresentation. Yeah, but I'm like very interested in that. And this is on the agenda. And then in terms of like feeling out of place, and that's why you move, I think that's like definitely part of what's going on. I think that's, definitely a reason why I moved so many times. So yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any final, Frank?
I just had a question that's related to the answer you gave to Ishan, which is, it was really interesting. You said that people in Germany tend not to move from rural areas to big cities. And I wonder why that's true. Is that a function of the fact they've got this very large Mittelstand in which you've got very successful cutting-edge industries that are located in a lot of small towns and more rural areas compared to the United States, in which case the two societies may not be all that comparable in terms of the motives of why people are moving.
Yes, thank you. So it's 17% of all migrants go from rural to urban places. So I think that's at least whenever I mention this, people are shocked. Now, I actually don't even know what the number in the US is, and this is also my to-do list actually to look that up, because my sense is there's actually also a lot of like urban migration in the US. But I think I think there's at least two things going on that are very much related to like what you just said, which is I think there's more diversification, like more like spatial deconcentration of industries in Germany compared to the US, and then obviously also like Germany is much smaller. So if I'm like living 3 hours away from here, we're on record, right? So I'm far away from the Bay Area, right? But if I live like 3 hours away from, say, Berlin in Germany, I'm like in another industrial cluster, right? So I think this like the notion of like rurality or like of being far away from the center of action is like very different in Germany. Like I grew up in like maybe like an hour and a half by train from Berlin, like super rural. In like my German perception, but like an hour and a half in like American standards, it's like, oh, I can do that like every day if I had to by car. So yeah, I think this is a very good point about like the comparability and like scope conditions. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Hans.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Thank you.